4 days. That's how long my wife had been missing before I stopped believing there was an innocent explanation. In 42 years of marriage, Margaret had never gone a single day without calling me. Not once. Every morning around 8 o'clock, my phone would ring. Sometimes she reminded me to take my vitamins. Sometimes she reminded me about appointments I already knew I had. Sometimes she called for no reason at all except to tell me what she was making for dinner. Those calls were so ordinary that I stopped appreciating them years ago. Then suddenly, they were gone. Margaret had traveled to Raleigh to spend 10 days with our son Brandon and his wife Cassie. It wasn't unusual. She visited them several times every year. The first evening, she called me to complain about Brandon's lawn. The second day, she sent me pictures of a casserole she was making for the grandchildren. The third day, there was nothing. No call, no text, no photo. I wasn't worried at first. Phones die. People get busy. Families become distracted. That's what I told myself. The fourth day, I called her 6 times. Every call went straight to voicemail. I called Brandon. No answer. I called Cassie. No answer. I sent messages. Nothing. By the 5th morning, fear had replaced every excuse I had been making. I stood alone in my kitchen, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold nearly an hour earlier. Something felt wrong. Not dramatic, not obvious, just wrong. The kind of feeling you get when a piece of your life suddenly shifts out of place. I grabbed a travel bag, threw in a few clothes, and headed for my truck. Before leaving, I called Brandon one final time. Straight to voicemail. I left no message. 6 hours later, I turned into my son's neighborhood. The entire drive had been filled with possibilities. Maybe Margaret lost her phone. Maybe she was in the hospital with a minor illness. Maybe Brandon had taken the family on a spontaneous trip somewhere. Every explanation sounded reasonable until I saw the house. The driveway was empty. The blinds were closed. The property looked strangely lifeless. My stomach tightened immediately. I parked at the curb and sat there for several seconds, staring at the front door. Margaret had asked me weeks earlier to bring a cookbook she accidentally left at our house during her previous visit. The cookbook sat on the passenger seat beside me. Looking back, I still remember how normal everything seemed in that moment. The warm weather, the quiet street, the children riding bicycles 2 houses away. Nothing looked dangerous. Nothing looked alarming. Yet every instinct in my body was screaming at me to pay attention. I grabbed the cookbook and started walking toward the front door. Halfway across the lawn, someone shouted behind me, "Sir?" I turned around. A man was running toward me from the neighboring property. He looked to be in his mid-50s, wearing work boots and a faded blue shirt. His face was red from exertion. But that wasn't what caught my attention. It was the fear in his eyes. Real fear. The kind that makes people abandon politeness and run across a stranger's yard. "Sir, wait!" he yelled again. I stopped walking. The man reached me a few seconds later, breathing heavily. For a moment, he couldn't seem to find the words. He glanced toward Brandon's house and then back at me. "You're Harold, right?" I nodded slowly. "Yes." He swallowed hard. "I'm Frank. I live next door." Something inside my chest tightened. The way he looked at me told me everything before he even opened his mouth. This wasn't a friendly neighbor introducing himself. This was a man carrying information he wished he didn't have. "What's wrong?" I asked. Frank looked toward Brandon's house again. His expression grew even more troubled. Several seconds passed before he finally spoke. "Don't go in there." Every muscle in my body went rigid. "Why?" Frank rubbed a hand across his face. He looked exhausted, guilty, like someone who had spent days arguing with himself. "Because something happened." My pulse immediately accelerated. Something happened to who? The question sounded strange coming out of my mouth because I already knew the answer. Frank lowered his eyes. "Your wife." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The sounds of the neighborhood faded away. The birds, the traffic, the distant laughter of children. Everything disappeared. There was only that sentence. "Something happened to your wife." My grip tightened around the cookbook. "What are you talking about?" I asked. Frank stared at me with an expression I will never forget. It wasn't fear anymore. It was guilt, pure guilt, the kind people carry when they realize they should have acted sooner. "I've been waiting for you to show up," he said quietly. A chill moved through my entire body. "Why?" Frank looked back toward Brandon's front door one last time. Then he took a deep breath and said the words that changed my life forever. Because 6 days ago, I heard your wife screaming for help from inside that house. For several seconds after Frank spoke, I couldn't process what I had just heard. My mind rejected the sentence completely. Margaret screaming for help? It didn't fit any version of reality I was willing to accept. My wife wasn't the kind of woman who panicked. She wasn't dramatic. She wasn't reckless. If Margaret screamed for help, something had gone terribly wrong. What exactly did you hear? I asked. Frank glanced toward Brandon's house again, before motioning toward his driveway. We walked a short distance away from the property. Only then did he begin talking. It was 6 days ago, he said, around 4 in the afternoon. Every word seemed difficult for him to say. I was working in my garage when I heard a woman yelling. My pulse quickened. What did she say? Frank swallowed hard. At first I couldn't understand it. I thought it was a television. He paused. Then I heard it again. My stomach tightened. And? Frank looked directly at me. She was yelling for help. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The warm afternoon suddenly felt cold. Frank continued. He said the voice sounded desperate, not angry, not frustrated, terrified. He walked outside and realized the sound was coming from Brandon's house. At first, he wasn't sure what to do. Most people don't expect to hear screams coming from a quiet suburban neighborhood. Most people convince themselves there must be another explanation. Frank did the same thing, until the back door opened. Your wife came outside, he said. My heart nearly stopped. You saw her? He nodded. I saw her. The expression on his face told me the image still haunted him. She looked weak. His voice lowered. Really weak. Every muscle in my body tightened. Frank described Margaret stumbling onto the back patio. According to him, she could barely stay on her feet. She looked pale, confused, disoriented, like someone who hadn't slept in days. She was trying to reach the driveway, he said quietly. I felt sick. Did she say anything? Frank nodded slowly. Just one word. My throat felt dry. What word? He stared at me for several seconds. Help. The world seemed to narrow around that single word. I could picture Margaret saying it. I could hear her voice. 42 years together creates memories so deeply rooted that you recognize them instantly. My wife had been trying to get help. My wife had been trying to escape. Then Frank's expression darkened. That's when Brandon appeared. A chill moved through my body. What happened? Frank looked away. He came out the back door. His jaw tightened, and he took her back inside. For several seconds, I couldn't breathe. My brain kept trying to reject what I was hearing. Brandon was my son, the boy I taught to ride a bicycle, the teenager who spent summers helping me repair fences, the young man Margaret defended every time we disagreed about his decisions. None of those memories matched the picture Frank was describing. Yet Frank never looked away, never hesitated, never changed a detail. Did you say anything? I asked. I started walking toward the fence. Frank nodded. I was going to help her. My pulse hammered inside my ears. Then what? Frank sighed heavily. Brandon waved me off. I stared at him. What do you mean? He said your wife was dehydrated. Frank shook his head. He said she wasn't feeling well. Another pause. He said everything was under control. The anger building inside me became almost unbearable. And you believed him? The question came out harsher than I intended. Frank looked down immediately. The guilt on his face answered before he spoke. For a little while. He nodded slowly. I wanted to believe him. Then his voice cracked slightly. Most people don't expect a son to lie about his own mother. I couldn't argue with that. Because a week earlier, neither would I. Frank disappeared into his garage for a moment and returned carrying a clear plastic storage bag. My stomach tightened immediately. What's that? He handed it to me. Inside was a folded piece of paper. The moment I saw it, something inside me knew. My hands trembled as I carefully unfolded it. The handwriting hit me like a punch to the chest. Margaret's. There was absolutely no doubt. After 42 years of marriage, I could recognize her handwriting anywhere. The message contained only a few words. Short, uneven, shaky, but unmistakably hers. Tell Harold, please, I'm sick. I read the note once, then again, then a third time. Each time felt worse than the last. Margaret hadn't simply disappeared. She had tried to reach me. Somehow, While trapped inside that house, she had found a way to get a message outside. Tears filled my eyes before I even realized it. Frank looked away, giving me a moment to collect myself. "I found it under my windshield wiper the next morning," he said quietly. I folded the note carefully. "Why didn't you call the police?" The question sounded cruel the moment it left my mouth. Frank winced. "Because I wasn't sure." He looked ashamed. I kept convincing myself there had to be another explanation. Then he shook his head. I was wrong. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Frank said something that immediately caught my attention. "There's something else." My stomach tightened. "What?" His expression became serious again. The next day, an ambulance came. My head snapped up. "An ambulance?" He nodded. "They took your wife away." Every nerve in my body suddenly went on high alert. If Margaret had left in an ambulance 6 days ago, there was only one question that mattered. Why hadn't anyone told me? Why hadn't Brandon called? Why hadn't Cassie called? Why had I spent nearly a week believing my wife was simply visiting family? I pulled out my phone immediately. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. As I started calling hospitals across Raleigh, one terrible realization kept repeating inside my head. Something happened inside that house. And whatever it was, my own son had tried very hard to keep me from finding out. The first hospital had no record of Margaret. The second hospital had never heard her name. The third transferred me 3 different times before telling me they couldn't find anyone matching her information. By the 4th call, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. Frank stood silently beside me while I paced across his driveway. Every unanswered question made the fear worse. Then the receptionist at the 4th hospital asked for Margaret's date of birth. My pulse immediately accelerated. I gave her the information. She placed me on hold. 30 seconds later, she returned. "Mr. Whitaker?" "Yes." My voice barely worked. "Your wife was admitted 6 days ago." The world seemed to tilt beneath my feet. 6 days. Margaret had been in a hospital for 6 days while I sat at home, believing she was spending time with our son. For several seconds I couldn't speak. The receptionist continued explaining where Margaret was located, but I barely heard anything after the words 6 days. One question kept repeating inside my head. Why hadn't Brandon called me? I ended the call and immediately headed for my truck. Frank tried to say something, but I was already moving. I don't remember much about the drive to the hospital. I remember traffic. I remember red lights. I remember gripping the steering wheel so tightly my hands hurt. Mostly, I remember fear. Real fear. The kind that strips away every comforting lie you've been telling yourself. 6 days. My wife had been lying in a hospital bed for 6 days. And somehow, my own son had decided I didn't need to know. 20 minutes later, I arrived at the hospital and practically ran through the front entrance. A nurse directed me toward the intensive care unit. Every step felt heavier than the last. By the time I reached Margaret's room, my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. Then I opened the door. Nothing could have prepared me for what I saw. Margaret looked 20 years older than she had 10 days earlier. Tubes ran from her arms. Medical monitors surrounded the bed. Her skin looked pale and fragile. Her eyes were closed. For several seconds, I simply stood there frozen. This wasn't the woman who had left our house laughing about Brandon's terrible lawn. This wasn't the woman who called me every morning. This looked like someone who had barely survived something terrible. Then her eyes slowly opened. The moment she saw me, tears immediately filled them. "Harold," she whispered. That single word nearly broke me. I rushed to her bedside and took her hand. It felt cold and weak inside mine. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. 42 years of marriage teaches you how to communicate without words. Eventually, I forced myself to ask the question that had been haunting me all day. "What happened?" Margaret closed her eyes. The fear that crossed her face frightened me more than anything else I'd seen since arriving. When she opened them again, I saw something I never expected to see in my wife. Terror. Real terror. "I thought I was going to die," she whispered. My stomach dropped. I squeezed her hand tighter. "Margaret." She shook her head slightly. Something was wrong. Her voice trembled. Very wrong. Slowly, she began telling me what happened after arriving at Brandon's house. The first couple of days had been normal. Family dinners, time with the grandchildren, helping around the house. Then, one evening, after dinner, She started feeling dizzy. At first, she assumed she was dehydrated. She drank water and went to bed early. The next morning, the dizziness remained, worse than before. Then came the nausea. Then, weakness. By that evening, she could barely stand without support. I asked Brandon to take me to urgent care, she said quietly. My jaw tightened. What did he say? Margaret looked away. He told me I was overreacting. Anger immediately surged through my body. What? She nodded. He said it was probably a stomach virus. The room suddenly felt smaller, more suffocating. Margaret explained that every hour she felt worse. Walking became difficult. Her hands started shaking. Her vision blurred. She knew something wasn't right. Margaret had spent years volunteering at hospitals. She understood her own body. This wasn't a simple illness. Something was seriously wrong. The following day, she asked Brandon again. This time, she requested an ambulance. My pulse accelerated. And? Tears appeared in her eyes. He refused. The words hit me like a physical blow. Refused? Margaret nodded slowly. He said I just needed rest. I stared at her in disbelief. You told him you needed an ambulance. Another nod. More tears. And he said no. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. My son. My own son. The boy Margaret had spent decades helping, protecting, and defending. The boy she would have sacrificed anything for. Then Margaret revealed something even worse. My phone disappeared. I looked at her immediately. What? I couldn't find it anywhere. Her voice cracked. I searched my purse, the guest room, the kitchen. Another tear rolled down her cheek. It was gone. A chill moved through my entire body. Suddenly, Brandon's silence made even less sense. Margaret hadn't simply failed to call me. She had been unable to call me. Then she told me about the moment Frank witnessed. She waited until nobody was watching and tried to leave the house. Every step felt impossible. She was weak, dizzy, barely able to stay upright, but she knew she needed help. She reached the back patio, then the driveway, then freedom, at least for a few seconds. Then Brandon came outside, she whispered. My hands tightened into fists. What happened? Margaret stared at the blanket covering her legs. For several seconds, she couldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. I begged him. The room became completely silent. I told him I was scared. More tears appeared. I told him something was wrong. She looked directly into my eyes. The pain on her face was unlike anything I had ever seen, and he stood in front of the door. Every part of me went cold, because in that moment, I realized this story was no longer about a misunderstanding. And deep down, I think Margaret realized it too. Margaret's words sat between us like something sharp enough to cut through 42 years of family memories. He stood in front of the door. I kept hearing them again and again. Not Brandon was confused. Not Brandon didn't understand. Not Brandon panicked. He stood in front of the door. That meant he had made a choice. My wife had been weak, frightened, and begging for help, and our son had chosen to block her path. For several minutes, I couldn't speak. I just held Margaret's hand while machines hummed beside her bed. Finally, I asked the question I feared most. Did he know how serious it was? Margaret didn't answer right away. She looked toward the window, where afternoon light stretched across the hospital floor. When she turned back to me, her face was calm in a way that frightened me more than tears. Yes, she whispered. He knew. Something broke inside me then. Until that moment, a small part of me had still been searching for an excuse. Maybe Brandon thought she had food poisoning. Maybe he believed she was confused. Maybe he didn't understand how sick she was. But Margaret's certainty left no room for comfort. She told me that during those final hours at the house, she could barely lift her head. She had trouble focusing. Her hands trembled so badly she couldn't hold a glass. She asked Brandon to call me, he said later. She asked him to call a doctor. He said tomorrow. She asked him for her phone. He claimed he didn't know where it was. Every answer delayed help. Every delay made her weaker. And through it all, Cassie stayed mostly silent. She watched? I asked. Margaret closed her eyes. Sometimes. My jaw tightened. Did she help you? A tear slid down Margaret's face. No. That answer felt like another betrayal, not as deep as Brandon's, but cold in its own way. Cassie had lived in that house. She had seen Margaret declining. She had heard the arguments. She had watched a sick woman beg for medical help, and she had chosen silence. Later that afternoon, the physician returned to discuss Margaret's condition. He explained that she was improving, but slowly. Her kidneys had been strained. Her blood pressure had dropped dangerously low. She had been severely dehydrated by the time emergency responders arrived. Then he mentioned the test results again. "We're still waiting on the final toxicology report," he said carefully. I looked up immediately. "You said there were substances in her blood that shouldn't be there." Margaret turned toward him too. The doctor's expression became cautious. "Some findings are unusual enough that we've consulted a toxicology specialist." My stomach tightened. Could this happen naturally? He hesitated. "Some conditions can mimic certain results, but given the circumstances, we have to investigate every possibility." The room became silent. He wasn't accusing anyone. Doctors don't speak that way without proof. But the meaning was clear enough. Something may have entered Margaret's body that should not have been there. After he left, Margaret stared at the ceiling for a long time. "Harold," she finally said, "what if this wasn't an accident?" I didn't answer, because the same thought had already been sitting inside me, growing colder by the minute. That evening, I called Richard Bell, an old friend and retired investigator who had helped me years earlier during a business dispute. I told him only the essentials. Margaret was hospitalized, Brandon hadn't called, Frank had witnessed something disturbing, and doctors had concerns about her blood work. Richard listened quietly. When I finished, he said, "Don't confront your son. I want answers." "You want truth?" Richard said. "Answers can be rehearsed." That sentence stayed with me. He told me to preserve everything. The note from Margaret, Frank's account, call logs, text messages, hospital records, travel timeline, anything connected to those missing days. "If this is nothing," Richard said, "you lose nothing by being careful. If it's something, every detail matters." I spent the next several hours building a timeline. Margaret's last normal call. Her first missed call. My messages to Brandon. My messages to Cassie. Frank hearing the scream. Frank finding the note. The ambulance arrival. The hospital admission. Every date. Every hour. Every unanswered call. As the timeline grew, one fact became impossible to ignore. Brandon had multiple chances to tell me Margaret was sick. He chose not to. He had multiple chances to call emergency services sooner. He chose not to. He had multiple chances to give her back her phone. He chose not to. By midnight, I was no longer asking why Margaret had disappeared for 4 days. I was asking why my son needed her isolated. The next morning, Richard called back. His voice was calm, but sharp. "I found something." My pulse quickened. "What?" "Brandon and Cassie have serious financial problems." I closed my eyes. "How serious?" Richard paused. "Bad enough that your son's mother may have looked less like a parent and more like a solution." The words made my stomach turn. I looked through the hospital window at Margaret sleeping, pale and fragile beneath the blankets. The woman who had spent her life rescuing Brandon might have become the very person he was willing to sacrifice. And for the first time since I arrived in Raleigh, I understood that the worst part of this story might not be what Brandon had done during those 4 days. It might be what he had planned long before Margaret ever walked into his house. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Margaret struggling across Brandon's backyard while begging for help. Then I saw something even worse. I saw the little boy she used to carry on her shoulders, the teenager she defended during every argument, the grown man she never stopped believing in. No matter how many mistakes Brandon made, Margaret always found a reason to forgive him. Looking back, that may have been the greatest strength of her heart and the greatest danger. Early the next morning, Richard arrived at the hospital carrying a thick folder. One look at his face told me he hadn't come with good news. We sat in a small family waiting room while Margaret underwent additional tests. Richard placed the folder on the table between us. "Before we talk about Brandon," he said quietly, "I need to understand something." I nodded. "What?" He opened the folder. "How much have you and Margaret given him over the years?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" Richard stared at me. "Money." I leaned back in my chair and sighed. The truth was embarrassing. Not because we had helped our son. Most parents do. The problem was how many times we had done it. The memories started flooding back. When Brandon was 23 and his first business failed, Margaret emptied a savings account to help him recover. When he fell behind on mortgage payments years later, she refinanced part of our property to help him keep his house. When credit card debt began piling up, she quietly paid it off without telling anyone. Every time life knocked him down, Margaret stepped in. Every time he made a mistake, she softened the consequences. Richard listened without interrupting. When I finally finished, he slowly closed the folder. "Do you realize how much that adds up to?" I shook my head. "No." Richard slid a spreadsheet across the table. The total nearly made me choke. Over the past 15 years, Brandon had received hundreds of thousands of dollars in direct and indirect financial assistance. Loans that were never repaid, debt settlements, mortgage support, emergency bailouts, educational expenses for the grandchildren, business investments. The number sitting at the bottom of the page felt unreal. I stared at it for several seconds. Margaret never saw it this way. Richard nodded. Mothers usually don't. The words hurt because they were true. Margaret didn't keep score. She didn't measure sacrifice. If Brandon needed help, she helped. It was that simple. Then Richard opened another section of the file. "Now let's talk about his current situation." My stomach tightened. This was the part I had been dreading. Brandon's finances were worse than I imagined. Much worse. Several accounts were overdue. Creditors had begun legal action. Business obligations were piling up. Personal loans were accumulating interest he couldn't afford. Some of the numbers were so large I had to read them twice. "How is this possible?" I asked. Richard shrugged. Years of bad decisions. Then he pointed to several highlighted entries. "And desperation." The word lingered in the air. Desperation changes people. It makes them rationalize things they would normally reject. It makes impossible ideas seem reasonable. For the first time, I found myself wondering what Brandon had been thinking during those weeks before Margaret arrived. Had he been afraid, angry, cornered? Or had he simply seen an opportunity? Richard continued flipping through documents. Then he stopped on a page that immediately caught his attention. Here's the part I don't like. I looked down. It was a meeting record from a local law office. "What's that?" Richard tapped the date. 3 weeks before Margaret visited. My pulse quickened. And? Brandon met with an estate attorney. The room suddenly felt colder. Why? Richard looked at me carefully. According to the notes, he asked questions about inheritance procedures. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Inheritance? Richard nodded. Specifically, parental assets. I stared at the paperwork. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. Maybe he was organizing future plans. Maybe he was trying to understand legal responsibilities. But none of those explanations felt convincing anymore. Not after everything else. Not after Frank's testimony. Not after the missing phone. Not after the delayed medical treatment. Richard seemed to be thinking the same thing. "One meeting doesn't prove anything," he said. "But timing matters." I nodded slowly. The meeting happened before Margaret arrived. Before she became ill. Before she ended up in intensive care. Yet somehow Brandon was already discussing inheritance. That fact sat in my stomach like a stone. Later that afternoon, I returned to Margaret's room. She looked slightly stronger than the day before. Strong enough to sit up without assistance. Strong enough to smile when she saw me enter. But beneath that smile, I could still see exhaustion. I sat beside her and held her hand. For a while we talked about ordinary things. The grandchildren, the garden back home, the neighbors. Small conversations people have when they're trying to avoid larger ones. Then Margaret suddenly became quiet. "Harold? Yes?" She hesitated. Before I got sick, Brandon kept asking questions. My heart immediately skipped a beat. Questions about what? Her expression changed. The smile disappeared completely. "Money." I felt my stomach drop. "What kind of money?" Margaret stared at the blanket covering her legs. "Our savings." A long silence followed. "Our investments." Another silence. "The house." Every answer felt worse than the last. Then she looked directly into my eyes. "And the will." My pulse exploded. Because at that moment, the pieces began fitting together in a way I desperately wished they wouldn't. Brandon wasn't just drowning in debt. Brandon wasn't just asking about money. Brandon wasn't just delaying medical care. He had been asking detailed questions about everything Margaret and I owned before she ever became sick. And for the first time, I found myself asking a question no parent should ever have to ask. Had my son invited his mother to Raleigh because he loved her or because he needed something from her? The next morning, I sat alone in a law office, staring at a document I never imagined I would sign. For more than 40 years, Margaret and I had planned our future together. We had written wills, updated them, revised them after the grandchildren were born. Everything was straightforward. If one of us died, the other inherited everything. After both of us were gone, the remaining assets would pass primarily to Brandon and the grandchildren. It was a plan built on trust, a plan built on family. Now, for the first time in my life, I no longer trusted my own son. The realization made me sick. Richard sat across from me while attorney Susan Keller reviewed the paperwork. Neither of them pressured me. Neither of them told me what decision to make. They simply laid out the facts. Brandon was drowning in debt. Brandon had secretly consulted an estate lawyer before Margaret became ill. Brandon had withheld critical information about his mother's hospitalization. Brandon had ignored repeated requests for medical help, and now there was an ongoing toxicology investigation. If I did nothing and something happened to Margaret or me, Brandon could gain control of assets worth more money than he had ever seen in his life. The thought alone was enough to keep me awake at night. "Are you sure?" Susan asked gently. I looked down at the documents. The changes were significant. Brandon would no longer control the estate. A professional trustee would oversee everything. Most of the assets would be protected until the grandchildren reached adulthood. Brandon's direct access would be severely restricted. Years ago, I would have considered such a decision unthinkable. Today, it felt necessary. I signed my name. The sound of the pen scratching across paper seemed strangely loud. A chapter of my life ended in that moment. Not because of money, because of trust. After leaving the law office, I drove straight to the hospital. Margaret was awake and reading when I entered. She smiled when she saw me, but the smile faded quickly. Something happened. It wasn't a question. 42 years together had made us experts at reading each other. I pulled a chair beside her bed and told her everything. The estate attorney, the new protections, the financial concerns. Margaret listened quietly. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she stared at the blanket covering her legs for several seconds. "I never thought we'd have to protect ourselves from Brandon." Her voice sounded broken. I reached for her hand. Neither did I. Tears appeared in her eyes. Where did we go wrong? That question hurt more than anything else. Parents always ask it when a child disappoints them. We search our memories looking for mistakes, looking for warning signs, looking for moments when we could have changed the outcome. But sometimes the answers aren't there. Sometimes good parents raise children who make terrible choices. Before I could respond, a knock sounded at the door. Detective Amanda Keller entered the room, carrying a thin folder. Margaret immediately sat up straighter. My stomach tightened. Detectives don't visit hospital rooms with good news. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitaker," she said, "I need to ask a few questions." The next hour changed everything. Keller explained that investigators had begun reviewing the timeline surrounding Margaret's illness. Several details concerned them. Most importantly, the delays in seeking medical treatment. The detective wasn't making accusations. Not yet. But she was asking questions no one had asked before. What exactly had Brandon said when Margaret requested help? When was she last seen healthy? Who prepared her meals? Who had access to her medications? The questions grew more specific with each passing minute. Eventually, Keller opened the folder. Inside were photographs from Brandon's property. My pulse immediately quickened. "What's that?" The detective slid one of the images toward me. It showed a locked cabinet inside Brandon's garage workshop. Another photograph showed several containers and bottles arranged on a shelf. Nothing looked unusual at first glance. Then Keller pointed toward one label. "Do either of you recognize this?" We both shook our heads. A toxicology consultant asked us to examine it more closely. My stomach dropped. Margaret looked frightened. "Why?" Keller hesitated. "Because some substances can produce symptoms similar to what you experienced." The room fell silent. Nobody said the words out loud. Nobody needed to. For the first time, an investigator was openly considering the possibility that Margaret's illness wasn't natural. That possibility terrified me. Yet something about Detective Keller's expression frightened me even more. She looked like someone who already suspected the answer. Before leaving, she handed me her card. "There's one more thing." I stood immediately. "What?" Keller studied me carefully. "We attempted to contact Brandon this morning." My pulse accelerated. "And?" The detective closed the folder. "He hired a criminal defense attorney." The room became completely silent. Margaret's face lost all color. I felt as though the air had been knocked from my lungs. People hire criminal defense attorneys for many reasons, but they don't usually do it before anyone has accused them of a crime. Keller headed toward the door, then paused. "Mr. Whitaker, yes? If Brandon contacts you, let us know immediately." After she left, neither Margaret nor I spoke for a long time. We didn't need to. The message was clear. Brandon knew the investigation was getting closer, and for the first time since this nightmare began, it felt like he was preparing for a fight. I knew the investigation had entered a new phase the moment Brandon hired a criminal defense attorney. Innocent people hire lawyers too. Richard reminded me of that repeatedly. But the timing bothered me. Nobody had accused Brandon of a crime. Nobody had arrested him. Nobody had even publicly named him as a suspect. Yet somehow he was already preparing for a legal battle. The question that kept me awake that night was simple. What was he afraid the police might find? The answer arrived 3 days later. I was sitting beside Margaret's hospital bed when Detective Keller called. Her voice was calm but direct. "Mr. Whitaker, we executed the search warrant this morning." My pulse immediately quickened. Margaret looked up from her book the moment she saw my expression. "Did you find something?" I asked. There was a brief pause. "Quite a few things." Less than an hour later, Richard and I met Keller at the police department. She led us into a conference room and placed several evidence photographs across the table. The first images showed Brandon's garage workshop. I recognized the room immediately. Over the years, Brandon had spent countless weekends building furniture and repairing equipment there. At first glance, everything looked normal. Then Keller pointed toward a locked storage cabinet. This was hidden behind shelving. Richard leaned forward. What was inside? Keller slid another photograph toward us. Several bottles sat neatly arranged on metal shelves. Some were common household products. Others were not. My stomach tightened. "What are we looking at?" The detective opened a folder. Our toxicology consultant requested testing on multiple substances recovered from the property. The room became silent. Keller continued explaining that investigators weren't drawing conclusions yet. Every item had to be tested. Every result had to be verified. But certain discoveries were concerning enough to justify expanding the investigation. Then she showed us something else. A notebook. Nothing about it looked remarkable. Spiral binding, worn cover, handwritten notes. Yet the detective treated it like gold. "We found this in Brandon's desk." Richard adjusted his glasses. "What's in it?" Keller opened the notebook to a photographed page. My heart immediately sank. Dates, times, detailed notes. At first they seemed random. Then I noticed a pattern. The entries matched Margaret's visit almost perfectly. Every day she stayed in Raleigh appeared somewhere in the notebook. Every meal, every symptom, every complaint, every change in her condition. The room suddenly felt colder. "Why would he write all this down?" I asked. Keller didn't answer immediately. "That's one of the questions we're asking." Another page appeared, then another. The further investigators read, the more disturbing the entries became. Some described Margaret feeling tired. Others described dizziness, weakness, nausea, the exact symptoms she later experienced in the hospital. Richard slowly leaned back in his chair. "This doesn't look good." Keller nodded. "No, it doesn't." For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then she revealed something even stranger. Brandon had searched online for medical information during the weeks leading up to Margaret's visit. Hundreds of searches, some innocent, some alarming. The detective handed me a printed report. I stared at the highlighted entries. Symptoms in elderly patients, severe dehydration, medication interactions, recovery timelines. Several searches appeared only days before Margaret arrived. My hands began shaking. "Why would he be researching this?" Keller answered carefully. "That's what investigators are trying to determine." The words sounded professional, neutral, but the concern behind them was impossible to miss. Later that afternoon, I returned to the hospital and shared only part of what I learned with Margaret. She was still recovering. She didn't need every horrifying detail. Even so, I could see fear growing in her eyes. "Harold," she whispered, "what if Brandon really did something?" I looked away, not because I didn't have an answer, because I did. For days I had been fighting against the possibility. For days I had been searching for alternative explanations. But every new discovery made that harder, much harder. Before I could respond, a knock sounded at the hospital door. Detective Keller stepped inside again. This time she wasn't carrying photographs. She was carrying a sealed envelope. My stomach tightened immediately. "What is it?" Keller looked toward Margaret before answering. The toxicology report came back. The room instantly became silent. Every sound seemed to disappear. Margaret gripped the blanket tightly. I felt my pulse hammering inside my chest. This was the moment everything had been building toward. The report would either support our fears or destroy them. Keller slowly opened the envelope. Her eyes moved across the first page, then the second. The expression on her face changed almost immediately. Not shock, not surprise. Confirmation. The kind people experience when evidence finally proves what they already suspected. My stomach dropped. "Detective?" Keller looked up. For several seconds she said nothing. Then she closed the folder and met my eyes. "Mr. Whitaker." Her voice was quiet. Margaret's illness was not caused by natural medical conditions. The room froze. Margaret stopped breathing for a moment. I felt the blood drain from my face. Keller continued. "The toxicology team identified substances in her system that should never have been there. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Because deep down, we all understood what those words meant. This was no longer a family tragedy. No longer a misunderstanding. No longer negligence. Someone had put those substances into Margaret's body. And for the first time since this nightmare began, the investigation officially became a criminal case. For a long moment after Detective Keller delivered the toxicology results, nobody in the room spoke. Margaret sat frozen in her hospital bed. I remained standing beside the window, staring at the detective as though I had somehow misunderstood her words. But there was nothing to misunderstand. The report was clear. The substances found in Margaret's bloodstream did not belong there. They were not produced naturally by her body. They were not related to any medication prescribed by her doctors. They had entered her system from an outside source. The implications were terrifying. Margaret looked down at her trembling hands. "Someone did this to me?" Her voice was barely audible. Keller answered carefully. "The investigation suggests that possibility. It wasn't a direct accusation. Detectives don't make accusations until they have evidence. But we all knew where the evidence was pointing. For several seconds, Margaret simply stared ahead. Then tears slowly filled her eyes. Not tears of fear. Tears of heartbreak. "Why?" she whispered. No one answered. Because no answer could make sense of something like this. Later that afternoon, investigators formally reclassified the case. What had begun as a medical emergency was now an active criminal investigation. Search teams returned to Brandon's property. Digital forensic specialists began reviewing electronic records. Financial investigators expanded their review of Brandon's accounts. Suddenly, the entire case accelerated. Every department seemed to be working at once, and the deeper they looked, the worse things became. The next morning, Detective Keller called again. This time her voice carried a different tone. "We need to discuss Cassie." My pulse quickened immediately. Up until now, most attention had focused on Brandon. Cassie had remained in the background, quiet, passive, almost invisible. "What about her?" I asked. Keller paused briefly. "Her story keeps changing." I immediately sat up straighter. During earlier interviews, Cassie claimed she knew very little about Margaret's condition. She insisted Brandon handled everything. She said she trusted his judgment. She claimed she believed Margaret simply had a stomach illness. But when investigators compared her recent statements with previous interviews, inconsistencies began appearing. Small ones at first. Different timelines. Different explanations. Different memories. The kinds of contradictions that often appear when people are hiding something. "Do you think she's involved?" I asked. Keller chose her words carefully. "I think she's scared." That answer stayed with me all day. Fear changes people. Sometimes it makes them lie. Sometimes it makes them tell the truth. The question was which direction Cassie would choose. 2 days later, we got our answer. I was visiting Margaret when Keller arrived unexpectedly. The detective looked exhausted, but beneath the exhaustion was something else. Momentum. Cassie requested another interview. My stomach tightened. And? Keller slowly sat down. This time she asked for an attorney. The room became silent. Margaret lowered her coffee cup. That's bad, isn't it? Keller nodded. Usually. Then she surprised us. But not always. Richard arrived shortly afterward and joined the conversation. Keller explained that people often request attorneys when they're preparing to cooperate against someone else. The possibility immediately changed everything. If Cassie was finally talking, Brandon's situation had become far more dangerous. That evening, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. I almost ignored it. Almost. Something told me not to. When I answered, there was silence for several seconds. Then a voice I hadn't heard since this nightmare began. Dad. My entire body tensed. Brandon. The room suddenly felt smaller, colder, more dangerous. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I asked the question I had imagined asking dozens of times. Why didn't you call me when your mother was in the hospital? Silence. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. 15. Finally, Brandon spoke. But not with an apology. Not with concern. Not with guilt. Have you talked to the police? My heart sank instantly. There it was, his first question. Not how's mom. Not is she okay. Not is she recovering. His first concern was the investigation. Every remaining piece of hope inside me began collapsing. Your mother nearly died. My voice shook with anger. Another silence followed. Then Brandon sighed. Not the sigh of a worried son. The sigh of a man frustrated by circumstances. Dad, people are making assumptions. I stared at the wall across from me. For 40 years, I believed I knew my son. Now I wasn't sure I knew him at all. Did you poison your mother? I asked. The silence that followed seemed endless. Eventually, Brandon answered. You should be careful who you trust. Then the line went dead. I lowered the phone slowly. My hands were trembling. Not because of what Brandon said, because of what he didn't say. He never denied it. The next morning, Detective Keller called with another update. Cassie had finally broken. During a lengthy interview, she admitted that Brandon controlled nearly everything inside the house during Margaret's visit. The meals, the medications, the schedules, the conversations. Most importantly, she admitted something investigators had suspected for weeks. Margaret repeatedly begged to see a doctor. Brandon repeatedly refused. The wall protecting him was beginning to crack. Yet Keller's final update frightened me more than everything else. There's something Cassie told us we haven't been able to verify yet. My pulse quickened. What? Keller looked directly at me. According to Cassie, Brandon started planning long before Margaret arrived. The room became completely silent, long before Margaret arrived, long before she became sick, long before anyone suspected danger. If Cassie was telling the truth, then this wasn't a terrible decision made in panic. It wasn't negligence. It wasn't recklessness. It was preparation. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I realized we might not be dealing with a desperate son. We might be dealing with someone who had been planning this for months. I didn't sleep at all that night. Brandon's final words kept replaying in my head. You should be careful who you trust. It wasn't a denial. It wasn't outrage. It wasn't the response of an innocent man falsely accused of hurting his mother. It sounded like a warning, the kind of warning people give when they know something is coming. By sunrise, I was sitting beside Margaret's hospital bed, drinking terrible coffee and staring out the window. Margaret had finally fallen asleep after a difficult night. Recovery was taking longer than doctors originally expected. Physically, she was improving. Emotionally, she was struggling. Every new discovery felt like another wound. A mother's heart can survive many things. Discovering that your own son may have wanted to harm you isn't one of them. Around 9 o'clock that morning, Detective Keller called. Her voice was unusually serious. We found something on Brandon's computer. My stomach immediately tightened. Over the past week, investigators had uncovered suspicious financial records, unusual toxicology evidence, hidden notes, and conflicting statements. I couldn't imagine what was left. What is it? Keller hesitated briefly. Preparation. The word sent a chill through my body. 30 minutes later, Richard and I met her at the police department. This time, the evidence wasn't physical, it was digital. Keller entered the conference room carrying a thick binder and several printed reports. She sat across from us and opened the first file. Our forensic team completed a review of Brandon's computer, phone, and cloud storage accounts. Richard folded his arms. And? Keller slid several pages across the table. He wasn't preparing for a medical emergency. My pulse accelerated. What was he preparing for? Keller looked directly at me. Life after one. The room fell silent. She began walking us through the evidence. Weeks before Margaret's visit, Brandon had created financial projections, showing multiple future scenarios. At first glance, they looked like ordinary budgeting spreadsheets. Then, investigators noticed something disturbing. Several versions included significant increases in available assets immediately following hypothetical inheritance events. I stared at the numbers. My stomach turned. These weren't random calculations. These were plans, detailed plans. Brandon had been estimating debt repayment schedules, property transfers, investment access, and future spending projections based on money he did not yet possess. Money that belonged to Margaret and me. How many of these are there? I asked. Keller turned another page. Dozens. Every answer made things worse. Then she revealed another discovery. Brandon had downloaded information about estate administration procedures, trust transfers, beneficiary rights, probate timelines. None of those things were illegal. People research inheritance issues every day, but context matters. Timing matters. And the timing was impossible to ignore. Brandon wasn't researching these topics after Margaret became ill. He was researching them before she even arrived. Richard slowly shook his head. This is planning. Keller nodded. That's our concern. Then she opened a second folder. There's more. My stomach dropped. Inside were email drafts Brandon had never sent. Some appeared to be notes written to himself. Others contained financial calculations. One draft included a sentence investigators highlighted in red. I read it twice before the meaning fully sank in. Once everything settles, the pressure disappears. The room felt colder. What pressure? I asked. Keller closed the folder. We believe he was referring to his debt. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The evidence was becoming impossible to explain away. Not because any single document proved guilt, because together they painted a picture. A picture of a man drowning financially while quietly preparing for a future that depended on access to someone else's assets. Later that afternoon, Keller shared another development. Cassie had agreed to a second formal interview. This time, she brought documents, bank records, credit statements, text messages. Information Brandon never expected investigators to see. According to Keller, Cassie looked exhausted, frightened, defeated. She had spent weeks protecting her husband. Now that protection was collapsing. During the interview, investigators asked why she finally decided to cooperate. Her answer was simple: because Margaret almost died. That sentence stayed with me, not because it was dramatic, because it was true. Whatever happened inside Brandon's house, whatever plans he made, whatever lies he told, the outcome was real. Margaret nearly died. No legal argument could change that. No attorney could explain it away. That evening, I returned to the hospital. Margaret was awake and watching the sunset through the window. For a while, we simply sat together. Then she quietly asked the question neither of us had wanted to say aloud. Do you think Brandon wanted me gone? The room became completely silent. I looked at the woman I loved more than anything in this world. The woman who spent decades protecting our son. The woman who never missed a birthday, a graduation, a crisis, or a failure. She deserved honesty, but she also deserved kindness. I don't know, I answered carefully. Margaret nodded slowly. I could tell she didn't believe me. The truth was becoming harder to avoid with every passing day. Before either of us could speak again, my phone vibrated. Another message from Detective Keller. Only 3 words. Cassie finally talked. My pulse quickened immediately. Attached to the message was a summary of her latest statement. I read the first paragraph, then the second, then the third. By the time I finished, my hands were shaking. According to Cassie, Brandon hadn't started planning weeks before Margaret arrived. He had started planning months before, long before the visit, long before the illness, long before anyone suspected danger. And the most frightening part wasn't that he had a plan. It was that Cassie believed Brandon had a specific date in mind from the very beginning. A date that was approaching much faster than anyone realized. Cassie's statement changed the investigation overnight. Until then, part of me had still been clinging to the idea that Brandon's actions had grown out of panic. a weak son facing financial ruin, a frightened man making terrible decisions under pressure. But Cassie destroyed that version of the story. According to her, Brandon had not reacted to Margaret's illness. He had prepared for it. The date she mentioned appeared in his calendars, financial projections, and private messages long before Margaret ever packed her suitcase for Raleigh. It was the day he expected his debts to come due, the day creditors would stop waiting, the day his entire life would begin collapsing unless new money appeared. And somehow, Margaret's visit had been scheduled just before that deadline. I read Cassie's statement 3 times while sitting beside my wife's hospital bed. Each time, the same cold feeling moved deeper into my chest. Brandon hadn't invited his mother because he missed her. He had invited her because he needed time, access, and opportunity. Margaret watched my face as I read. "It's bad, isn't it?" she asked. I wanted to protect her from the answer, but she was tired of being protected by lies. "Yes," I said quietly. "It's bad." She closed her eyes. For a moment, she looked smaller than I had ever seen her. Then she whispered, "Tell me." So I did. Not every detail, not the cruelest parts, but enough. Enough for her to understand that Brandon's planning began months earlier. Enough for her to understand that Cassie had stopped defending him. Enough for her to understand that this was no longer about one terrible mistake. Margaret listened without interrupting. When I finished, she did not cry. That frightened me more than tears. She simply stared toward the window and said, "I kept saving him, Harold." My throat tightened. "I know. Every time he failed, I told myself he just needed one more chance." Her voice stayed calm, but I could hear something breaking underneath it. "Maybe I wasn't helping him." I took her hand. "You loved him." She looked at me then. Love without boundaries can become permission. I had no answer for that, because she was right. For years we had called it support. Brandon had called it family. Maybe somewhere along the way, he had started calling it something else entirely: entitlement. The next morning, Detective Keller arranged a formal meeting. Cassie had agreed to cooperate fully in exchange for consideration from prosecutors. Richard and I attended with Margaret's permission. She was not strong enough to sit through it herself. The meeting took place in a small interview room at the police department. Cassie looked nothing like the confident woman I remembered from family gatherings. Her hair was pulled back carelessly. Her face was pale. Her hands shook whenever she reached for water. She couldn't look at me at first. That alone told me she knew what she had helped protect. Detective Keller began with simple questions. When did the conversation start? What exactly had Brandon said? How much did she know? Cassie answered quietly. At first, her words came slowly, almost mechanically. Then they began pouring out. Brandon had been angry for months. Angry at creditors. Angry at failed business partners. Angry at us. He believed Margaret and I had more than enough to solve his problems. He said we were being selfish by waiting until death to pass money down. He complained that parents were supposed to help their children while they were alive. He called our retirement savings unused money. He called Margaret's caution control. The more Cassie talked, the clearer the pattern became. Brandon had not seen his mother as a person in danger. He had seen her as a locked account, a future payout, an obstacle standing between him and relief. At one point, Cassie began crying. "I didn't think he would really hurt her," she said. My hands curled beneath the table. "But you knew he was thinking about money." She flinched. "Yes. You knew Margaret was getting worse." More tears. "Yes. You knew she asked for help." Cassie covered her face. "Yes." The room fell silent. Keller waited several seconds before asking the most important question. "Why didn't you call anyone?" Cassie lowered her hands. Her answer was so quiet I almost didn't hear it. "Because I was afraid of what he'd do if I ruined everything." There it was. Everything. That word said more than she intended. To Brandon, Margaret's suffering had become part of a plan, a thing that could be ruined. Not an emergency, not a moral line, a plan. Later that day, Brandon called me again. This time, I answered with Detective Keller, listening on another line. I did not tell him that. "Dad," he said, sounding tired, "we need to talk." His voice carried none of the urgency a son should have when his mother is recovering from suspected poisoning. "About your mother?" I asked. Silence. Then he said, "About the police." My heart sank even though I expected it. "Your mother nearly died, Brandon." "I know." His tone was impatient. And I'm sorry she's sick, but people are twisting this. I closed my eyes. Did you ask how she is? Another silence followed. What? Since this started, I said, my voice shaking, have you once asked how your mother is? He exhaled sharply. Dad, don't do that. Do what? Make this emotional. Something inside me went still. Make this emotional. As if the woman lying in the hospital bed was a legal inconvenience. As if 42 years of marriage and a lifetime of motherhood were distractions from the real issue, which was his exposure. I looked at Detective Keller through the glass. Even she seemed disturbed. I'm going to ask you one question, I said. Did you know she needed help? Brandon didn't answer. 5 seconds passed. 10. Then he said, You don't understand what I was dealing with. That was not a confession. Not legally. But to a father, it was enough. I ended the call without another word. That evening, Margaret asked what he had said. I told her only the truth that mattered. He still hasn't asked if you're okay. She looked down at her hands. For the first time since I found her, anger appeared in her face. Not loud anger, not bitter anger, clean anger, necessary anger. Then stop protecting him, she said. The next morning, Detective Keller called. Prosecutors had decided to move forward. Formal charges were being prepared. Brandon would be arrested within days. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt the strange grief of watching a child become someone you would have crossed the street to avoid. Then Keller said one final thing before ending the call. Mr. Whitaker, Cassie gave us one more detail. My pulse quickened. What detail? Keller paused. Brandon had already packed a bag the night before the ambulance came. The room went cold around me. Why? We don't know yet, she said. But based on the contents, it looks like he was preparing to leave town. I stood there holding the phone, unable to move. Because if Brandon had packed a bag before his mother was taken to the hospital, then he hadn't only been preparing for money, he had been preparing for escape. The morning after Detective Keller informed me that formal charges were being prepared, I arrived at the hospital expecting to find Margaret resting. Instead, I found her sitting upright in bed, staring out the window. There was something different about her expression. The fear that had dominated the past 2 weeks seemed diminished. Not gone, just replaced by something else. Resolve. For the first time since I found her in that hospital room, she looked like a woman who had made a decision. You're up early, I said as I entered. Margaret turned toward me and managed a small smile. I couldn't sleep. I sat beside her. Bad dreams? She shook her head. Memories. The answer immediately caught my attention. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she looked down at her hands and quietly said, I keep thinking about our last real conversation. My stomach tightened. Throughout the investigation, we had discussed symptoms, doctors, evidence, finances, and timelines. But we had never talked in detail about Brandon's final confrontation with his mother. Part of me suspected Margaret had been avoiding it. Another part suspected she simply wasn't ready. Now she was. What happened? I asked gently. Margaret stared out the window again. When she began speaking, her voice sounded distant, as though she were reliving every moment. It was the day before I tried to leave. The room became silent. She explained that by then she already knew something was wrong, not just physically, emotionally. The atmosphere inside the house had changed. Brandon wasn't acting like himself. Every conversation somehow returned to money. Every discussion became an argument. Every concern she raised seemed to irritate him. Then, during dinner, Brandon asked another question about our finances. One question too many. He wanted to know exactly how much we had saved. My jaw tightened immediately. Margaret nodded. Not generally, specifically. She looked at me. Numbers. For the first time in her life, she refused to answer. Brandon didn't take it well. According to Margaret, his entire demeanor changed. The friendly son disappeared. The patient son disappeared. What remained was someone angry, frustrated, bitter. He said I didn't trust him. She paused. Maybe I didn't. I remained silent. Margaret continued. She told Brandon that constantly asking about money made her uncomfortable. She reminded him that she and I had worked for decades to build financial security. She explained that retirement savings weren't lottery winnings waiting to be distributed. They were protection against uncertainty, medical bills, emergencies, aging, things every responsible adult understands. Brandon exploded. Not physically, verbally. Years of resentment suddenly poured out of him. According to Margaret, he accused us of caring more about money than family. He accused us of controlling him. He accused us of never believing in him. The irony would have been laughable if it wasn't so tragic. No one had believed in Brandon more than Margaret. No one. I told him he was wrong, she said quietly. What did he say? Margaret looked away. Tears appeared in her eyes. He said I owed him. The words hit me harder than I expected. Owed him. Not helped him. Not supported him. Owed him. The entitlement buried inside those two words was staggering. Margaret explained that Brandon began listing everything he believed life had denied him. Failed businesses, bad investments, lost opportunities, career setbacks. Somehow every disappointment became someone else's responsibility. Every failure became someone else's fault. Most of all, ours. Then came the moment Margaret couldn't forget. I told him I loved him. Her voice cracked slightly. I told him I'd always love him. Tears rolled down her cheeks now. And do you know what he said? I already knew I wasn't going to like the answer. She swallowed hard. He said love doesn't pay bills. The room became completely silent. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Of all the cruel things Brandon had done, that sentence somehow felt different, because it exposed exactly who he had become. Margaret wasn't talking to a desperate son anymore. She was talking to a man who measured everything by value, everything by profit, everything by what it could provide him. Then Margaret told me something investigators had never heard. After the argument ended, Brandon remained sitting at the kitchen table. He thought she had gone upstairs. He thought she couldn't hear him, but she had stopped halfway up the staircase when she heard him speaking on the phone. Who was he talking to? I asked. Margaret shook her head. I don't know. My pulse quickened. What did he say? Her answer came slowly, carefully. He said, it was supposed to be easier than this. Every muscle in my body tightened. Margaret nodded. Then he said something else. The room seemed to hold its breath. If she would just cooperate, none of this would be necessary. For several seconds, neither of us spoke, because those words changed everything. They didn't sound like frustration. They didn't sound like panic. They sounded like planning. Deliberate planning. The kind of language people use when an outcome has already been decided. Margaret lowered her eyes. That's when I got scared. I understood why. Not because Brandon was angry, not because he was desperate, but because, for the first time, she realized she was no longer dealing with a son asking for help. She was dealing with someone who viewed her as an obstacle. Later that afternoon, Detective Keller arrived at the hospital. After hearing Margaret's account, the detective remained silent for a long moment. Then she opened her notebook and wrote several pages of notes. When she finally looked up, her expression was grim. There's something you should know. My stomach tightened. What? Keller exchanged a glance with me before answering. Brandon was arrested this morning. Margaret closed her eyes. I felt no satisfaction, no victory, only sadness. But Keller wasn't finished. During the search of his vehicle, investigators found something we missed before. My pulse quickened immediately. What was it? Keller slowly opened a folder and placed a photograph on the bed between us. The moment I saw it, my blood ran cold. Because inside Brandon's travel bag was a one-way plane ticket purchased 3 days before Margaret was hospitalized. And the destination wasn't another city. It was another country. For several seconds after Detective Keller showed us the photograph, neither Margaret nor I spoke. A one-way international plane ticket, purchased 3 days before Margaret was hospitalized. Not after the ambulance arrived, not after police became involved. Before. The significance of that detail settled over the room like a weight. Brandon hadn't packed a bag because he was afraid of an investigation. He had packed a bag because he was preparing for something long before anyone suspected a crime had occurred. Where was he going? Margaret finally asked. Keller looked down at the file. Costa Rica. The room fell silent again. I stared at the photograph lying on the hospital blanket. Inside the travel bag, investigators had found clothes, cash, travel documents, and copies of financial records. It wasn't the luggage of someone taking a vacation. It looked like the luggage of someone preparing not to come back. Margaret slowly turned her head away. I could see tears forming again. Not because of the plane ticket itself. Because every new piece of evidence pushed Brandon further away from the son she remembered. Keller spent the next several minutes explaining the arrest. Brandon had been cooperative, calm, almost strangely calm. He requested an attorney immediately and refused further questioning. According to investigators, he showed very little emotion when informed of the charges. That detail disturbed me more than I expected. Most people panic. Most people react. Brandon simply adapted. It was as if he had already prepared himself for this possibility. After Keller left, Margaret remained quiet for a long time. Then she surprised me. "I want to know everything." I looked at her carefully. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "No more protecting me." Her voice was firm. "No more softening things." For the first time since this nightmare began, I realized something important. Margaret wasn't trying to save Brandon anymore. She was trying to understand him. The next morning, Richard called before sunrise. Cassie signed the cooperation agreement. My pulse immediately quickened. For weeks, investigators had been waiting for this moment. Cassie had hinted. Cassie had implied. Cassie had slowly revealed pieces of the truth. Now she was finally prepared to tell the entire story. By noon, Detective Keller arranged another meeting. This time, Cassie wasn't sitting beside Brandon's attorney. She wasn't protecting anyone. She looked exhausted, frightened, and emotionally drained. But she also looked relieved, like someone carrying a burden she could no longer hold. Keller started recording the interview. "Tell us everything." Cassie nodded. Then she did exactly that. The story began months before Margaret's visit. Brandon's financial problems had become catastrophic. Creditors were demanding payment. Lawsuits were becoming likely. Business opportunities had disappeared. Every solution Brandon tried failed. According to Cassie, that was when his obsession with Margaret and Harold's finances began. At first, it sounded harmless. Questions about retirement. Questions about investments. Questions about future inheritance. Then those questions became plans. Brandon started creating spreadsheets, calculating assets, estimating timelines, predicting what his life would look like once he gained access to money that didn't belong to him. My stomach turned as Keller read portions of the statement aloud. This wasn't desperation anymore. It was entitlement. Then came the most important question. Whose idea was it? Cassie immediately looked down at the table. Tears appeared in her eyes. When she finally answered, her voice barely rose above a whisper. Brandon's. The room became completely silent, not because the answer shocked anyone, because hearing it spoken aloud made it real. For months, I had wondered whether Cassie influenced him, whether someone else pushed him, whether financial stress created a situation neither of them controlled. Cassie's answer destroyed those possibilities. Brandon started it. Brandon planned it. Brandon drove it forward. The detective asked her to explain. Cassie described arguments that lasted late into the night. Brandon repeatedly insisting that his parents had enough money to solve his problems. Brandon repeatedly claiming that Harold and Margaret cared more about savings than family. Brandon convincing himself that he deserved access to everything they owned. Then Cassie revealed the detail that finally shattered any remaining doubt. According to her, several weeks before Margaret arrived, Brandon told her something she would never forget. Soon, everything changes. My hands tightened into fists. Keller looked up. What did he mean? Cassie wiped tears from her face. I asked him the same thing. The room became silent. He told me not to worry. Another pause. He said we'd never have money problems again. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Because the meaning was impossible to ignore. Brandon wasn't reacting to circumstances. He was anticipating them, preparing for them, counting on them. Then Keller asked the question that mattered most. Did Brandon ever express concern for his mother's safety? Cassie immediately broke down crying. The answer came between sobs. No. My heart sank. Not once. Not during the illness. Not during the ambulance ride. Not during the hospitalization. Not during the investigation. Every concern Brandon expressed revolved around himself, his debts, his future, his exposure, his risk. Margaret wasn't a mother anymore. She was a variable inside a financial problem. When the interview finally ended, Keller closed the file and looked directly at me. This is the statement we've been missing. She was right. The toxicology report proved a crime likely occurred. The searches, spreadsheets, and notes suggested preparation. But Cassie's testimony connected everything together. For the first time, Investigators could clearly explain motive, planning, and responsibility. Brandon's defense was beginning to collapse. Later that evening, I returned to the hospital and shared the truth with Margaret. I expected tears. I expected heartbreak. Instead, she listened quietly until I finished. Then she asked only one question. "Did he ever ask about me?" The answer hurt as much now as it did the first time. "No." Margaret nodded slowly. A tear rolled down her cheek. "Then I already have my answer." The room fell silent. Outside the hospital window, the sun was beginning to set. Inside, a mother was finally accepting a truth she had spent her entire life refusing to believe. Her son had stopped seeing her as family long before this nightmare began. And in 3 weeks, he would have to face a jury that was about to learn exactly what he had become. 3 weeks passed between Brandon's arrest and the start of the trial. And during that time, I watched Margaret slowly rebuild pieces of herself that had been shattered. Her strength returned faster than her peace of mind. She could walk on her own again. She could laugh occasionally. She could sit outside the hospital and feel sunlight on her face. But every improvement seemed to be followed by another painful realization. The hardest truth wasn't that someone had poisoned her. It wasn't that investigators believed her son was responsible. It was that Brandon never once asked whether she was alive, recovering, or suffering. Every message from his attorneys focused on evidence. Every request focused on the case. Every concern focused on himself. Margaret stopped crying about it after a while. Somehow that was worse. The morning the trial began, the courthouse was surrounded by reporters, cameras, and spectators. What had started as a suspicious hospitalization had become one of the most talked about criminal cases in the state. People weren't just interested in the investigation, they were interested in the betrayal. A son accused of turning against the very woman who had spent her life protecting him. Margaret sat beside me as we entered the courthouse through a private entrance arranged by Detective Keller. She looked nervous, but determined. For the first time since this nightmare began, she wasn't afraid of the truth anymore. She wanted it exposed. The prosecution spent the first several days building a timeline that left little room for doubt. They presented Brandon's financial records, his inheritance research, the toxicology findings, the notebook documenting Margaret's symptoms, and the evidence recovered from his computer. Each witness added another piece to the puzzle. Frank described hearing Margaret scream for help. Doctors explained how close she came to dying. Investigators detailed the planning that occurred before her visit. By the end of the first week, the prosecution had established something powerful. This wasn't a sudden mistake. It was a pattern, a plan, a sequence of choices. Yet the most important witness had not testified yet. Everyone knew it. The attorneys knew it. The judge knew it. The jury knew it. Cassie. When she finally entered the courtroom, the atmosphere changed immediately. She looked exhausted. The confidence she once carried had disappeared months earlier. For a brief moment, she glanced toward Brandon. He never looked back. That single detail seemed to hurt her more than anything else. After taking the oath, she answered a few routine questions before the prosecutor finally asked the one everyone had been waiting for. "Mrs. Whitaker, who first began discussing your in-laws' money." Cassie lowered her eyes. The courtroom became completely silent. "Brandon." The answer landed like a hammer. The prosecutor continued. "Who created the financial projections?" "Brandon." "Who researched inheritance procedures?" "Brandon." "Who repeatedly complained about his parents' finances?" "Brandon." Every answer pushed him deeper into trouble. The defense objected several times, but the damage was already done. For months, Brandon's attorneys had suggested that Cassie played a role in influencing him, that she contributed to the financial pressure. That responsibility was shared. Cassie's testimony destroyed that strategy. She admitted her own failures. She admitted remaining silent. She admitted ignoring warning signs. But she refused to accept responsibility for decisions Brandon made himself. Then the prosecutor asked the question that changed the entire trial. Did Brandon ever discuss what would happen after Margaret became ill? Cassie's hands began trembling. For several seconds, she couldn't speak. The judge instructed her to take her time. When she finally answered, her voice was barely audible. "Yes." My pulse quickened immediately. The prosecutor stepped closer. What did he say? Tears appeared in Cassie's eyes. He said everything would finally be fixed. A murmur spread through the courtroom. The prosecutor continued. "What did he mean by that?" Cassie looked toward the jury. "The debt." Another silence followed. He said we'd never have money problems again. I glanced toward Margaret. Her face had gone pale. Not because she was hearing something new, because she was hearing it publicly, officially, under oath. The prosecutor allowed the silence to settle before asking one final question. During all of these conversations, did Brandon ever express concern for his mother's health? Cassie immediately shook her head. No. Not once? No. The answer echoed through the courtroom. Several jurors exchanged glances. One woman slowly shook her head in disbelief. The prosecution rested shortly afterward. The defense spent the next day attempting to challenge witnesses and create doubt. But something had shifted. The jury wasn't just looking at evidence anymore. They were looking at motive, character, intent. The image Brandon had spent years creating was beginning to collapse. Then, late that afternoon, something unexpected happened. Brandon's lead attorney stood and requested a brief conference with the judge. The discussion lasted nearly 20 minutes. Nobody in the gallery knew what was happening. Reporters whispered. Spectators speculated. Even prosecutors appeared surprised. Finally, the judge returned to the bench and addressed the courtroom. The defense intends to call the defendant as a witness. A ripple spread through the room. I felt Margaret stiffen beside me. Richard looked genuinely shocked. Experienced defense attorneys rarely allow their clients to testify when the evidence is overwhelming. The risks are enormous. One wrong answer can destroy an entire case. Yet Brandon was insisting on taking the stand. As court adjourned for the day, I watched him rise from his chair. For the first time since his arrest, he looked confident, not nervous, not defeated, confident. As though he still believed he could explain everything away. As though he still believed he was the victim. Later that evening, Detective Keller called me with information she had just received from prosecutors. Brandon had personally demanded the opportunity to testify. His attorneys advised against it. He ignored them. Why would he do that? I asked. Keller was silent for several seconds. Then she answered with a sentence that sent a chill through my body. Because Brandon still thinks he can convince people that none of this was his fault. I hung up the phone and stared out the hotel window for a long time. The trial was already going badly for him. The evidence was overwhelming. The jury looked unconvinced. Yet somehow, Brandon believed he could talk his way out of it. The next morning, he would finally take the stand. And for the first time, everyone in that courtroom would hear what Brandon believed happened. I had a feeling it was going to be the biggest mistake of his life. The next morning, every seat inside the courtroom was filled before proceedings even began. Reporters crowded the back rows. Legal analysts occupied entire sections of the gallery. People who had followed the case for months waited quietly for the moment everyone knew was coming. Brandon Whitaker was about to testify. I sat beside Margaret as we watched him enter the courtroom. For the first time since his arrest, he looked completely confident. His suit was perfectly pressed. His expression was calm. His posture was relaxed. If someone had walked into the room without knowing the facts, they might have mistaken him for the victim. That confidence unsettled me more than anger ever could, because it meant Brandon still believed he could explain everything away. When he finally took the witness stand, his attorneys began with simple questions. His childhood, his marriage, his financial struggles, his relationship with his parents. Brandon answered smoothly, almost too smoothly. He described himself as overwhelmed by debt, burdened by stress, and unfairly targeted by investigators searching for someone to blame. He admitted making mistakes. He admitted poor financial decisions. He admitted arguing with Margaret, but every answer followed the same pattern. Nothing was his fault. Someone else was always responsible. A business partner betrayed him. The economy hurt him. Creditors pressured him. His parents misunderstood him. Even Margaret's illness became something that simply happened around him rather than something he helped create. For nearly 2 hours, his attorney guided him through a carefully prepared narrative. Several jurors listened attentively. A few even appeared sympathetic. I could see why Brandon believed testifying was a good idea. He had always been persuasive. Ever since childhood, he could talk his way through trouble better than anyone I knew. But persuasion only works until facts arrive. And facts were waiting. When the prosecution began cross-examination, the atmosphere changed immediately. Assistant District Attorney Rebecca Lawson approached the witness stand carrying only a thin folder. No dramatic gestures, no raised voice, no theatrics, just confidence. She began with a simple question. Mr. Whitaker, How many times did your mother request medical assistance during her visit? Brandon shifted slightly. I don't remember. Lawson nodded. You don't remember? No. She opened the folder. Would it help refresh your memory if I showed you your own notebook? The confidence on Brandon's face weakened slightly. The prosecutor displayed the pages recovered during the search. Every date, every symptom, every complaint Margaret made, carefully documented in Brandon's handwriting. The jury watched silently. You remembered enough to write this, Lawson said. Brandon hesitated. I was keeping track because I was worried. The prosecutor nodded. Worried enough to document her symptoms? Not worried enough to call an ambulance? A few jurors immediately looked up. Brandon's attorney objected, but the damage was done. For the first time, Brandon looked uncomfortable. Then Lawson moved to the next subject. The inheritance research. The spreadsheets. The financial projections. One by one, she displayed them on the courtroom screens. Every document pointed toward the same reality. Brandon wasn't preparing for his mother's recovery. He was preparing for access to money. Can you explain why you created financial projections based on assets that did not belong to you? Brandon attempted a smile. People plan for the future. Lawson nodded again. Most people don't schedule someone else's money into that future. A ripple moved through the gallery. Brandon's smile disappeared. Then came the plane ticket. The prosecutor held it up for the jury to see. This was purchased 3 days before your mother was hospitalized, correct? Brandon swallowed. Yes. One-way ticket? Yes. International destination? Yes. Travel bag already packed? Brandon hesitated. Yes. The courtroom became silent. Lawson stepped closer. Why were you preparing to leave the country? Brandon looked toward his attorney before answering. I needed time away. The prosecutor didn't blink. Before or after your mother became critically ill? No answer came. For the first time, Brandon looked trapped. Then Lawson delivered the blow that changed everything. She played a recording from one of Brandon's phone conversations recovered during the investigation. The courtroom speakers crackled to life. Brandon's voice filled the room. Once this is over, everything changes. Silence followed. Then another voice asked, Are you sure? Brandon responded immediately. It has to happen soon. The recording ended. Every juror stared at him. Every reporter typed furiously. Every remaining piece of confidence vanished from Brandon's face. Yet the prosecutor wasn't finished. She approached the witness stand one final time and asked the question that mattered more than every document, recording, and financial record combined. Mr. Whitaker, your mother spent 6 days in the hospital. Brandon remained silent. During those 6 days, how many times did you contact her physicians? Silence. How many times did you visit her bedside? Silence again. How many times did you ask whether she was going to survive? The room felt frozen. Brandon looked down. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, he whispered, I don't know. Lawson's voice remained calm. The answer is 0. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. You never called. Another pause. You never visited. Another pause. You never asked if she was alive. I looked toward Margaret. Tears were rolling down her face. Not because of the evidence. Not because of the trial. Because hearing the truth spoken aloud made it impossible to deny anymore. Brandon wasn't simply guilty of terrible decisions. He had stopped caring about the person who loved him most. Lawson slowly returned to the prosecution table. The courtroom remained silent. Brandon sat motionless on the witness stand. His carefully constructed story had collapsed. Then something unexpected happened. Brandon suddenly looked toward Margaret, directly at her. For a brief moment, nobody spoke. Then he said something that stunned the entire courtroom. You could have helped me. The silence that followed felt endless. Margaret stared at him in disbelief. Brandon shook his head slowly. All of this could have been avoided. My stomach turned. Even now. Even after months of evidence, even after nearly losing his mother, even after facing prison, he still blamed someone else. He still believed he was the victim. Several jurors looked visibly disgusted. One man actually shook his head. Brandon's own attorney closed his eyes for a moment, as if realizing exactly what had just happened. The prosecution didn't need another question. Brandon had destroyed himself. Court recessed shortly afterward. As people began leaving the room, I saw something I hadn't seen since this nightmare started. For the first time, Brandon looked afraid. Truly afraid. Because he finally understood what everyone else in the courtroom already knew. The jury no longer doubted what happened. The only thing left to decide was how much of his life he was about to lose. And the next morning, 12 strangers would make that decision. The jury returned their verdict the following afternoon. Despite everything that had happened during the trial, despite all the evidence, all the testimony, all the months of investigation, I still felt sick as Margaret and I entered the courtroom. A small part of me remained trapped in the past. A part that still remembered Brandon riding a bicycle down our driveway. A part that remembered school graduations, family vacations, and Christmas mornings. No matter what he had done, no matter what the evidence proved, he was still my son. That reality made the final day harder than I ever imagined. The courtroom was packed long before proceedings began. Reporters filled every available seat. Spectators lined the walls. Even people who had never met our family seemed emotionally invested in the outcome. Margaret sat beside me, holding my hand so tightly that neither of us could feel our fingers. Across the room, Brandon sat with his attorneys. For the first time since the trial began, he looked uncertain. The confidence that carried him through his testimony had vanished. The excuses were gone. The arrogance was gone. What remained was fear. Real fear. The judge entered. Everyone stood. Then the jury filed into the box. The room became completely silent. The foreperson rose. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it. On the charge of aggravated poisoning. The silence felt endless. We find the defendant guilty. A murmur moved through the courtroom. Margaret squeezed my hand. On the charge of criminal neglect resulting in serious bodily harm. Guilty. Another murmur. On the charge of unlawful financial exploitation. Guilty. One after another, the verdicts continued. Guilty. 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 Every word felt heavier than the last. By the time the foreperson finished reading, Brandon had been convicted on every major count. The courtroom remained silent for several seconds before the reality fully settled over everyone present. Margaret closed her eyes. Tears rolled down her cheeks. I wrapped an arm around her shoulders. She wasn't crying because Brandon lost. She was crying because the truth had finally won. For months, she had questioned herself, questioned her memory, questioned her instincts. Now 12 strangers had looked at the evidence and confirmed what she already knew in her heart. She had been betrayed. Sentencing occurred 3 weeks later. By then, the media attention had only grown. Legal experts described the case as one of the most disturbing examples of elder abuse they had seen in years. Yet inside the courtroom, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the judge's final decision. Before announcing the sentence, Judge Rebecca Harmon addressed Brandon directly. The room became completely silent. "Mr. Whitaker," she began, "throughout this trial, I searched for evidence of remorse." Brandon stared forward. "I searched for concern regarding your mother's suffering." Another pause. "I searched for accountability." The judge slowly removed her glasses. "Instead, I found excuses." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Most people spend their lives hoping for a parent like Margaret Whitaker. Tears filled Margaret's eyes immediately. The judge continued. "A mother who sacrificed repeatedly for her child. A mother who offered support when support was undeserved. A mother who continued loving her son long after many others would have walked away." The room remained silent. Then came the sentence nobody would ever forget. "You viewed that love not as a gift, but as an asset." Brandon lowered his eyes. "You viewed your mother not as a person, but as an opportunity." Several jurors nodded quietly. "That betrayal makes this crime especially cruel." The judge then imposed the sentence. 22 years in state prison. Additional financial penalties. Permanent restrictions preventing Brandon from ever managing assets belonging to vulnerable adults in the future. The moment the sentence was announced, Brandon finally broke. His shoulders collapsed. His face turned pale. For months he had convinced himself he could escape consequences. Now reality stood directly in front of him. Deputies approached to escort him away. Before leaving, he turned toward Margaret. For a brief moment, mother and son looked at each other. Neither spoke. Then Brandon disappeared through the courtroom doors. And just like that, the chapter that had consumed our lives came to an end. The months that followed were surprisingly difficult. People assume justice automatically creates healing. It doesn't. Justice creates closure. Healing requires time. Margaret continued therapy. So did I. Some days were good, some were terrible. There were mornings when she woke from nightmares. There were evenings when I found myself staring at old family photographs, wondering where everything went wrong. Recovery wasn't a straight line, but it was progress. 6 months later, we sold our house and moved to a smaller community near the coast. For the first time in years, life felt quiet, peaceful. Then one afternoon, a letter arrived. The return address came from a state correctional facility. I immediately knew who sent it, Brandon. I placed the envelope on the kitchen table and stared at it for nearly an hour. Margaret eventually joined me. Neither of us touched it. "Do you want to read it?" I asked. She looked at the envelope for a long time. "Not today." The letter remained unopened for nearly 2 weeks. Finally, one evening after dinner, Margaret carried it onto the back porch. The sun was beginning to set over the water. Without saying a word, she opened the envelope and started reading. I watched her expression carefully. There was no anger, no shock, no tears, just quiet reflection. When she finally finished, she folded the pages and placed them beside her chair. "What did he say?" I asked softly. Margaret stared toward the horizon. "He apologized." The answer surprised me. "Really?" She nodded. "No excuses." Another pause. No request for money. More silence followed. No blaming anyone else. For the first time in years, Brandon had apparently accepted responsibility. I wasn't sure whether that meant redemption was possible. Some wounds never fully heal. Some consequences never disappear. But it mattered. Margaret sat quietly for several minutes before speaking again. "I don't know if I can forgive him." I reached for her hand. "You don't have to." She looked at me. I smiled gently. "You only have to keep living." Tears filled her eyes. This time, they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of release. During the following year, Margaret became involved with several organizations focused on protecting elderly adults from abuse and exploitation. Eventually, we helped establish a foundation that provided legal resources and emergency support for vulnerable seniors. What happened to us could never be undone, but perhaps it could help someone else. Perhaps that was enough. 1 year after the trial, Margaret and I sat together on a quiet beach watching the sunset. The sky glowed orange and gold as waves rolled across the shoreline. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then Margaret smiled and asked, "Do you think he'll ever understand what he did?" I thought about the question carefully. Then I looked toward the horizon. "Maybe," she nodded. "Maybe isn't certainty." "No," I agreed, "but it's enough." Another silence settled between us. Peaceful this time. Not painful, peaceful. Then Margaret leaned against my shoulder and watched the last light disappear beyond the water. In that moment, I finally understood something I had spent months getting wrong. I thought justice would arrive the day Brandon lost everything. I thought justice would arrive with a guilty verdict, a prison sentence, and public accountability. But I was wrong. Justice arrived much later. It arrived the first time Margaret laughed without forcing it, the first time she slept through the night, the first time she stopped, blaming herself for someone else's choices, the first time she smiled and genuinely meant it. As the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, I looked at the woman I loved and realized we had survived the worst chapter of our lives. The betrayal was real, the pain was real, but so was the future. And for the first time, in a very long time, the future belonged to us.